So my name is Christian Rangen. I'm the lead author of the report and also the book, working with my team. And again, I just mentioned this. Really invite you to join the conversation as we're proceeding. And again, this whole thing really started with the book that we're working on. It's due to come out probably late 2020. And there's a number of interesting aspects that we've been developing working with innovation cluster programs. So in the book, we introduce a number of new concepts and tools. We look at the national cluster frameworks. We look at something we call cluster value impact. We introduce cluster configuration models and a number of strategy concepts for innovation clusters and superclusters. But right now, we're still in the research and writing phase, and we're doing a lot of interviews to understand this more in different parts of the world. So stay tuned for that. Something we also have, and maybe some of you are familiar with this, is we've been producing a lot of tools. These are completely open source, so anyone can go online and download them. Working with cluster initiatives in Malaysia, working with cluster initiatives in Switzerland, working with cluster initiatives in Norway. We've been developing, kind of based on action research, a number of different strategy tools. Now, those are freely available. In the report, we introduce a total of 6. And in this presentation, I'll be going through a few of them. Now, it'd be very interesting to us if any of you basically go online and you download and you start using, we call it start testing them, and come back to us and say, you know, how did it fit for you guys? Did it make sense? Was it meaningful? Was it useless? You know, if you're able to sort of pick it up and then give us feedback, that's something we're always very curious of. So before we get into the main content, I really want to say thanks to a lot of people. There's a large number of people that have been involved in the work over the last really 4, almost 5 years. We have leading representatives from the Malaysian ecosystems and the Malaysian government. We have people in Switzerland. We have a number of people in Norway in the Norwegian cluster program. We also have people at the very local cluster level. So there's a lot of cluster managers and cluster board members that we've been able to speak with in the interview. We also have a number of international experts. I mentioned Jerome and Maretta. We also have people in Canada and the US. So a large number of people really deserve a big thanks for being open and forthcoming in the conversations we're having. So the executive summary. So here are 3 key findings that we find. I think they're worth sort of repeating. Number 1. We generally find that superclusters are on the rise globally. And just this conversation this morning with Australia, they were just sort of starting to look into this and have these very early conversations. So we see that from China, Canada, Norway, even Latin America, there are now a number of conversations, government initiatives, early practices around the concepts and the ideas of innovation superclusters. Some of these are entirely new to clusters, so they're starting without a foundation, while others have a solid foundation and they're just evolving into. So we expect between now and 2030 to see a number, maybe even a massive number of supercluster initiatives in different parts of the world around different themes and topics. So that's number 1. Number 2, and I barely alluded to this, we see that a lot of clusters and a lot of cluster managers are basically in for a massive paradigm shift. This is positive for many, it's challenging for some, and then it's difficult for a few, but it effectively means that a large number of clusters need to shift away from their really heavy research focus, so continue the research, but shift away from the research focus and the triple helix framework and really expand into what we call the 5-point or the pentagon model, which makes it almost a requirement for clusters, big or small, to start more seriously connecting with startups and scale-ups and more seriously start connecting with venture capital and private risk funding. We're seeing this trend also at the EU level. We're seeing this trend sort of across research in Europe, most recently with a report that came out in the UK called Scaling Up. So we're seeing a sort of big shift, and it's also, I think it's a big opportunity for clusters to be a part of this increase in venture capital and growth capital and an increase in entrepreneurship and scale up across Europe, Latin America, Middle East, and Asia. And finally, it does take visionary governments. It is extremely hard and very unlikely to be able to develop superclusters without strong government leadership. Now, that leadership can take different roles. I'll be explaining that towards the end. But if you don't have strong government support, strong government buy-in, it's extremely difficult. Now, some countries will do this on a national level, Canada being one, while others will most likely do it on a regional level, maybe Spain, maybe Australia, where they have much stronger regional government leadership or local government leadership. But to be blunt, you need strong and visionary governments to be able to successfully build and scale these superclusters. So what is a supercluster? Now, different people have different perspectives. Different people will give you different answers, and we try not to define it too narrowly. So we've said in the report that there are probably 6 different definitions, and you can kind of mix and match between these. So first of all, we say that innovation superclusters are engines of economic growth, and you get those engines to work by connecting hundreds of members and partners. Innovation superclusters are magnets because they're able to attract and pull in talent and capital and investors and corporates and academics and young researchers. People want to go to those regions and locations because that's where it's happening. That's where it's happening for artificial intelligence. That's where it's happening for seafood and aquaculture. That's where it's happening for mobility. On a global scale, these are the leading clusters, and that's where you want to be if you're getting into this space. Third, there are also collaboration networks, but they're collaboration networks specifically built around what we call industries of the future or future growth industries. So typically, if you're Australia, maybe you don't want to build innovation superclusters around coal because it's an industry that will be slowly phased out. You're more likely to build an innovation supercluster around solar energy or autonomous mobility, industries that may become much more important in the future than they are today. Innovation superclusters actively solve industry-level challenges. They're public-private, but really they are trust-based collaboration platforms. Now, some cultures will intuitively take that and say, we get that, while we also recognize that some cultures will be a little bit challenged by what do you mean by trust-based collaboration platforms? Large degree of trust, large degree of sharing, large degree of openness, large degree of open innovation, and a large degree of collaboration across traditional organizational boundaries or silos. So these are aspects. And what we find is that some superclusters have different aspects. Some will be more on the magnet side, some will be more on the collaboration side, but you can usually recognize all of these 6 elements. Now, something that's very important, and I know many of you are familiar with this, is of course the triple helix framework. And the triple helix framework is in large parts of the West really the foundation for the national innovation policies. It's been incredibly important to shift corporates and shift companies into the knowledge-based economy over the last 25 years. And it's really a matter of connecting corporates to academia, to relevant research, and government's role is to facilitate that connection. So that paradigm is now being challenged, and it's probably being challenged quite significantly. So this is building on research coming out of MIT, it's building on research coming out of Harvard and BI, the Norwegian Business School, as well as a lot of work around ecosystems, where we're now seeing a blending, if you will, between the ecosystem research and thinking and the cluster research and thinking. I think we're gonna see more on that, and we're actually working on a new book, the next book, on how those clusters and ecosystems are shifting. Now, once you accept this shifting paradigm, you see this doesn't replace the triple helix, but it expands the triple helix. And that's important because you can use the triple helix infrastructure that you have and add on these two other pillars. And the first pillar is capital, private risk capital. Within let's call them old clusters or legacy clusters, they typically won't have any private investors. Again, that's subject to change, and some regions will have different answers, but typically it's not the case. When you get into the innovation supercluster, you will typically have a shared language of what is the average financial velocity, which a lot of people don't really comprehend, but it's effectively what is the amount of capital raised per startup divided by the number of years that startup has been in operation at an aggregated level for the supercluster. Now, if you're in the US, if you're in Berlin, if you're in London, if you're in some of these really thriving innovation hotspots, that average financial velocity will typically be quite high. But once you get into Europe, you get into Latin America, maybe in parts of the Middle East and parts of Asia outside of China, you're going to find that the financial velocity is just drops to zero. This is important. We fundamentally believe that innovation superclusters need to have an active capital strategy. They need to plan it, they need to learn it, they need to invite and include investors. So any sizable innovation cluster should have up to 20% of their member base coming from the private risk capital side, not government funds, not sovereign wealth funds, but private investors. You need to build ecosystem level knowledge and skills. You need to make it attractive for investors. You need to build competencies at the cluster level. You need to run learning programs. You need to, a lot of activities to make sure that capital is a naturally integrated part of the cluster and the cluster landscape. And that, of course, requires you also to connect to startups. So every supercluster, or even just ambitious cluster, will need startups, scale-ups, accelerators, incubators, venture builders, fast track to IPO programs, and a lot of these more entrepreneurial mechanisms that some clusters naturally have, but many clusters haven't even started on. And we find massive difference in even just understanding this. A lot of clusters that we've talked with, they don't even have a way of counting startup members because they've never even tracked them. Others, they have a pretty well-developed what we call supercluster accelerator strategy. So they know exactly how to best accelerate the different types of startups. They know how much money their different startups need. They know what kind of mentorship they need. They know what kind of board members they need. So the cluster management is able to pinpoint exactly the pain points startups have, and then actively at a cluster level help solve those challenges. Now, probably the area that has the most low-hanging fruit for growth clusters and early superclusters is improving how they work with startups and scale-ups and accelerators. But then we also, of course, have the corporates. How do you secure the industry leaders in your cluster? You have universities, business school, and research lab, and I think that we can probably expect a growing focus on not local universities, but really the leading universities globally. So we shift a lot of cluster focus from the regional to the global. And we definitely have the importance of alignment with government. Now, one thing that I'm seeing a lot is many clusters are completely disconnected from the national conversation. And I think that's a big mistake. Clusters need to position themselves, and especially when you get into the more ambitious supercluster stage, you need to position yourself at the intersection of the national transformation conversation. So if you're in Australia, that's an energy conversation. If you're in Malaysia, that is TN50 and the technology. If you're in London, it's definitely a large part of the fintech. So I believe that many clusters will benefit as they mature into superclusters by being part of that big national long-term transformation conversation, which very often isn't the case. Now, one thing that we also introduce in the report is a number of what we call very small case studies. And this is an interesting case study on the Norwegian solar cluster. And what you see here is actually how the solar cluster about a year ago, last year summer, worked with these 5 areas. So here you have one of these strategy tools that's freely available. You can download it, where you say, okay, what are we actually doing on the entrepreneurial side? What are we doing on the investor capital side, and so on. And this process actually led to the solar cluster hiring a very specific investor relation manager, which by most clusters isn't even a position. It's not even a relevant person to have. So if we dig a little bit deeper into what does a supercluster actually do? and I know there are different perspectives on this. What we find in our conversation, and in our interviews, and in our research is that first and foremost, superclusters connect and collaborate. So they bring in members, and they connect them, and they do collaboration projects. Second, a large number, but not all, they also look at what we call educating the ecosystem level. So they have a big focus on training, coaching, mentoring, and developing innovation skills within the companies, within the startups, within the mentors, within the investors. And they really practice what we call open innovation in practice. Now that long-term thinking, that long-term almost vision, it's very apparent in some clusters. And there's a large amount of clusters where they don't have this strategic mindset and the strategic vision. But a big part for innovation superclusters is this concept of a magnet, and I'm seeing really interesting conversations around that, and that really seems to resonate, where strong, well-developed superclusters are no longer just focused on the regional and the local actors and the building a better local network between existing companies, but it's really a matter of attracting new companies, attracting new investors, and attracting new startups and new researchers to build a much more dynamic world. Now, this requires different people. It requires different messaging. It might mean that if you're in Spain, you also need to make sure that you have an English language website. If you're in Norway, you definitely also need to have an international strategy and an international communication strategy. And again, we're seeing a big difference in the conversations we're having, where some clusters will naturally say, yes, we want to attract the best people in the world, while others say, no, we're mostly here to serve our local existing members, and we're going to stay with that. One thing that we find really strongly, though, is that great clusters and also great superclusters, they really focus and they care about solving industry level challenges. And one thing that we've developed is what we call the Supercluster Open Innovation Map, and this was developed together with the Norwegian Seafood Innovation Cluster and their innovation manager, who's a fabulous guy and been extremely helpful with this work. And this works in a way that you can plot in what are the industry-wide challenges that our supercluster can actually attack and solve. What are some of the partially industry, partially company-specific challenges, and what are some of the that are only company-specific? Now you combine those, and you get a framework for working with and discussing open innovation. So with an example in the mobility space, you can say the cluster has identified 2 shared industry challenges. There's no national policies for autonomous mobility, and there's no national research agenda. Now, those are things that a good functioning cluster can work on. You can also identify a lot more. So there's zero growth capital, there's limited venture funding, there's no test sites. Now, these would be examples of things that the cluster can address and solve. Then there are some things that are just company specific. So our company doesn't have a strategy, our board doesn't believe in the market potential. So these are things that are more company specific, and the cluster would address this differently. Now we find that this is really interesting and also a really powerful way for the cluster to work. And we see that a growing number of clusters really find that this resonates, and either they already have been doing it, or they say, this is interesting, we want to get into it. So we see that for clusters, don't not focus too much on the organizing and the meetups, but look for what are the shared challenges that we have, what are the shared problems that we have, And if we can attack those, rethink those, solve those, that would be really powerful. And it would allow the So how do we get started on this? And again, just to show you a little bit of work from the report. One thing that we found, and this wasn't clear to at least me in the beginning, but it became clear in the conversation, is try framing a problem statement. And some do this very easily and they answer it like fluidly. Others really struggle with it. What are the problems you hope an innovation supercluster might help you solve? Here are some examples. You know, we want to develop Industry 4.0. We want to create new jobs. We want to increase GDP. We want more unicorns. We want more entrepreneurs. We want to lead this energy transformation that's happening on a global scale. We want to build new industries. We find that different clusters, although they may carry the same titles, say ocean cluster or seafood clusters, they answer this very, very differently. Now, the answers you get here is naturally going to affect what you do next in terms of how you build the cluster strategy. And we really find that many struggle with this. It's really fascinating when we dig into the Canadian program, the Canadian Supercluster, we actually find a number of different problem statements that has sort of developed and emerged in those conversations going back over the last couple of years. So one problem statement was, what do we envision as the future of the province and the country in 20 years? That was one. It's very broad as a problem statement. How can we develop and keep more unicorns, or what the Canadians call narwhals? Because the problem was that Canada didn't really have a lot of those highly valued, rapidly growing growth companies. And if they did, they tend to leave the country. How do we develop more digital growth companies? How do we shift the economy from natural resource extraction into more high tech? And how do we create more value from the oceans? Now, as you probably can see, those problem statements are quite different. So depending on which problem statement you want to focus on, you will quickly have a very different strategy for the cluster. So that's just Canada. Now, we find that this is extremely important, and partially based on this, we developed something we called the Supercluster pre-assessment card. So this is also one of the tools you can download online. And it really starts with the problem statement. So you can use this tool individually with your key stakeholders, with your cluster board, with your national politicians. You can sit down with the Prime Minister, have a cup of coffee and go through this. You can get some friends together, form an informal working group. So you can approach this in different ways. But you start with the problem statement. What are the problems you hope an innovation supercluster might help you solve? That has to be the starting point. Then you have economic context, you have future, and then you get into more of the detail. Now, if we look at a case, this is a fictive case, a fictitious case in Asia, you can probably say, okay, we need to develop new high-tech industries, national culture for innovation, and we want to shift away the value creation from agriculture to technology. So those are problem statements. Economic context, there's slow growth, rising unemployment, there's political infighting. We do have a future 2050 vision of the country. We want to grow the GDP from 12,000 US to 30,000 per capita, and we want to become a leading knowledge hub in our part of the world. Those are future aspirations. And then when you get into more of the details, you can say, okay, what are we actually trying to achieve? What are the key leadership people that we have and we want to have as a part of this? In this case, we have multiple industry CEOs. We have somebody from the president's office. We have 2 startup communities. We have the World Bank and SoftBank. We have 3 universities. We have goals, and then we have design. Now, of course, everyone will get different input to this. But I think that working through this Supercluster pre-assessment card will hopefully provide some pretty interesting conversations or interesting reflections in your conversations. So we're seeing right now countries in Africa, countries in the Middle East, countries in Asia that are starting to sort of sit down and say, okay, what do we do? What does this look like? And what does this tell us? And some of them do it really well. They do it pretty easy. And others say, this is really challenging. This was difficult for us. But this is the pre-assessment card. What's also in the report, briefly, and it's also available online, are 2 of the most common tools that we have been using over the last 4.5 years. So one is the Supercluster launch. So this is a tool that we would typically recommend in large groups and large working formats. So you can use it with people that aren't familiar with clusters or superclusters. So you can have industry leaders, you can have researchers, you can have academics, you can have students, you can have stakeholders, you can have government, you can have a lot of different people come together and discuss these things collaboratively. And if you print these in large formats, say A0 or like 1.5 meters by 1 meter, you have large scale work canvases that you can work on. Supercluster launch is for those extremely early stage conversations. If you get to a little bit more mature stage, you have what we call the Supercluster Strategy Map. And again, this is built around that original research by MIT. But as you see here, we bring a lot of the different pieces together, and we ask a large number of we call good questions or strategic questions that may or may not be relevant, for that specific cluster. Now, in this example right here, we have smart city in the middle. So we say, okay, what is your cluster theme? Well, in this case, it's smart city. Then we have what are the markets, who are the business developers, who are the cluster leaders, who are the key members, and then you move out to what are the key issues around capital, what are the key issues around the corporate, what are the key issues around government, around academics and entrepreneur. Now, we have probably run several hundred people through this. Extremely powerful, you get a lot of insights, you get a lot of understanding, and you can do this with small groups, large groups, or massive groups, depending on how you frame it. Or you can just solve it sort of by yourself. But we're seeing these kind of tools helping create better understanding and helping create better conversations. How do you sort of get started on this? Now, I know this really differs, but this slide has been really interesting, and a lot of people have a lot of questions around this one slide. Now, some of you probably sit inside really well-developed clusters and really well-developed cluster programs. Some of you may sit inside well-developed ecosystems, and some of you may not even be involved in any cluster initiatives at all. But what we find is that there are 4 ways that these superclusters get started. Number one in my upper left is research. So you have people studying what already exists. So these researchers will typically say, okay, what are the leading industries? What are the leading future industries? And hey, by the way, look what we found. Look what we found. We found a already pre-existing, naturally emergent cluster. With a little bit of tweaking, a little bit of support, you can grow this from a naturally emergent cluster and into a real supercluster. It was already there, we just didn't see it. So that's one way. The second way, that's the lone hero. The lone hero is really an ambassador. He or she is able to create enthusiasm, connect people, come up with new visions for economic development in the region or in the country, and then sort of make that happen. And one of my absolute favorite examples is the CEO for the Norwegian solar energy cluster. They're on their way to becoming a more international and maybe even a supercluster in the future. When she started it, there was a lot of skepticism. A lot of people said, there's no sun in Norway, and this is true. We don't have a solar industry. That was also partially true. What natural competitive advantage do we have? There's no funding for it. And there were all these reasons. But she persisted. She got a few kind of key people on board. And then she kind of transitioned over to the other side where it says bottom-up industry-led. So she managed to get some traction at the industry level. She managed to get some former industry CEOs on board. And combined, they were able to bridge this and then push it upwards. And that's the third option, where we see industry leaders coming together, connecting and saying, we should develop this because it makes sense for us to collaborate. And then they go up to the government level. Now, the fourth way the superclusters get started, that's a top-down government-led. So that would be initiated and funded by the government and then implemented downwards. Now, if that happens as a downwards only motion, it's not going to work. Governments that are overly optimistic on government top-down implementation is not going to get any footing. It's not going to get anywhere. So what you really what you really need, and this is maybe a trick answer, you really need the combination of all these four. You need to build on pre-existing strengths to a certain degree. That's the research. You need to have a number of local evangelists to actually kick things off on the ground. You need to have significant industry-led interest and enthusiasm, and you need to have a good government program, ideally on the national level, at a minimum at a regional level. Now, you can build superclusters with one or maybe two of these lacking. It's going to be really difficult. So ideally, you want to make sure that you have all four of these building blocks. And we find really different kind of practices around that and experiences with that. That's big difference. So I'm just seeing a comment here from Alan. I'll try the name, Alan Karozha. We are lone heroes in Slovenia. Yeah, I like that. I think a lot of people that I meet and I speak with, maybe especially in Asia, recognize this and say, you know, I'm quite lonely. I really want to do this. I really want to drive this through, but it's a little bit challenging. So the recommendation for the lone hero is actually connect to the ecosystem around you, connect to key industry leaders, and maybe former CEOs or former chairman on the board, so you can get a few kind of key industry people, and then combined you can go up to the government level. That's easier said than done, but that is kind of the motion that works. So the conclusion, and then we're going to open for some more questions, is really three things. Number one, this concept of innovation supercluster is really on the rise. Globally, there are about maybe 7,000 clusters, but it really depends how you define them. There's around 3,000 recognized clusters in the EU, and there's a massive number in Asia, formal and informal. But there aren't that many superclusters. Superclusters is a pretty new thing. Some confuse it with ecosystem development. Some confuse it with big collaborative research projects. But the way we understand it, superclusters can be built and designed and developed. It's challenging, it takes time, but it can be done. And we expect to see a large number of supercluster initiatives, some successful, some not, in the coming 10 years. Second point, we're really facing a cluster paradigm shift. So we can expect a lot of people within the existing cluster landscape to say, you know, this doesn't feel right, we don't like it, we don't agree with it, and that's fine. But at a absolutely theoretical level and research level, we're going to see a new body of knowledge emerge around much more dynamic, much more entrepreneurial innovation clusters and superclusters. And we have significant work on this in the book, and we've been going through large parts of that section in the book with some researchers, and we're getting a lot of interesting conversations. Finally, very important, yes, challenging, but very important, you need to have visionary governments at the regional level or the national level, ideally national level, who can help you build that national framework and help do the national funding and make sure that it gets on the national economic policy radar that's required. Those are the three findings. Those are the main conclusion from the report. And we're really building on this and expanding on this as we go into the book. Now, I don't know, many of you may have had a look at the report. Some of you may have read it, and some probably haven't seen it at all. But in the report, you'll see that we go into much more detail. And there's also probably aspects in the report that we didn't cover. But if I can be of any help and answer any questions now, I'd be happy to. And so I'm going to go back to it. If you're interested in this and you want to sort of get your hands on it, there's a lot of material under what we call strategy tools, which is our open source toolkit. So you can go online, you can find, I think it's close to 20 different tools that we've been using with clusters and superclusters around the world. So these are built by action research and action collaboration in Asia, in Europe, and also in the Nordics. So I hope they may be helpful. And finally, before I get into the questions, we are testing, so we're planning to potentially run a global cluster leadership program as an online program. So that will be a 4-week online, plus a face-to-face workshop in Antwerp just before the TCI. We're testing this. We haven't launched it, but it'd be very interesting to hear if this could be interesting to you guys. This is work in progress. So let me open for some questions and comments, and we'll try to get through those. The first question, are superclusters always national? Do you have an example of multinational superclusters? Yeah. So superclusters will typically be multinational or global, but they will always have a national anchoring. So if you dig into them, you can kind of find home being in one specific country, but they will always reach outside of their national borders. So they will have international reach with a strong home base somewhere. Successful government-led superclusters. So government-led will be two examples. Number one, I would actually mention China and the Chinese Torch program. Now, some people could argue that that's not really a cluster program, but I would actually say that it is. The cluster program, the Torch program really started about 25 years ago. It's now discontinued because it has run its course, but that really laid the foundation for a lot of the tech industry and the clean energy industry that we see today in China. So you see the effects, 2 decades after. The most relevant right now is the Canadian program with the Canadian Supercluster program, which is really a massively ambitious project. We need to see the results, but my impression is that it's doing really well, and they're able to achieve largely what they were hoping to in the Canadian example. What are the key differences with ecosystem development? This is covered more in the report, but the big difference between supercluster and ecosystem is superclusters are built around specific teams, topics, or industries. For example, healthcare. For example, clean energy. For example, autonomous ships. Ecosystems are much more general. Ecosystems can have many different topics and themes at the same time. There'll be much more overlap. Second, superclusters are legal organizations with governance structures, budgets, salaries, annual reporting, and all those formal things. Ecosystems, free-flowing. There might be different people representing it, but it doesn't have a sound, solid legal structure. How is the success of a supercluster program? This is a really good question, Susan. Different superclusters will have different KPIs. Measuring the success of any cluster initiative is extremely hard. Quote James Wilson, who's researching this. But still, a lot of governments and programs try. I think it's important to define what are success metrics for us, how do we define success, and what are the KPIs that we are tracking because they make strategic sense for us. Now, some national programs will want to say how many jobs have we created, what is the increase in GDP, what is the increase in profit per company. Some of those things are a little bit hard. Each cluster, define your own success, define your own KPIs, define your own metrics, and measure on that. We have a question from Carmen. Have you considered the possibility of including society as a sixth pillar? It's a good question. So it has come up as a previous question. You also have a question around UN Global Sustainable Development Goals. So I think we've considered a lot of things, but so far at least decided to leave it out, but it's a good point. And we have a question from Zaga. What are the differences between supercluster and digital innovation hubs? Great question. Maybe that difference is very small. My understanding of digital innovation hubs is that those are more ecosystem based, so you can have many different initiatives or industries or topics at the same time. Also, my experience is that digital innovation hubs are more entrepreneurial, so you'll have more startups and investors, but typically you don't have corporates and academia deeply involved, and you usually don't have that strong government support. But we also find in the research we're doing a lot of bad language and bad definitions. So when some say digital innovation hub, they might actually mean a digital innovation cluster, and vice versa. So I would really have to look at that sort of on a case-by-case basis to be more helpful. Typical clusters refer to a proximity zone, around 1.5 hours driving. Is this true for superclusters too? Okay, Tulabari. That's a good comment. So one of the things that we cover in the report is you have 3 levels of cluster. Emerging cluster, or EC, growth clusters, or GC, and then superclusters, or SC. Emerging clusters are very local. Emerging clusters have this proximity zone. They're primarily valuable because of the local networking connectivity. Superclusters, totally different game. That local proximity zone isn't really that applicable. There are different kind of relationships, matchmaking events. Now, proximity matters, but it matters much more for the young and immature clusters than it does for the well-developed international superclusters. We have a question from Tuana. How can international superclusters cover transport regions and yeah, okay, so this is a long question, and it's a good question. So I'm not going to be able to give a very short answer, but I think to be successful, these international superclusters need to focus on strong identity, branding, high quality organizations, governance structures. They need also to be able to work much more on the communication, so media, social media outreach. And then as they get into the deliverables, so running projects, deliver service, innovation, collaboration projects, they simply need to work at a much bigger scale or better scale and deliver more impact than traditional smaller cluster are able to. One example that we were working on in Switzerland was when we develop a drone cluster in Switzerland, what should be our focus? Should it be local in that region around Zurich? Should it be pan-European, or should it be global? And if it's global, how do we collaborate with Chinese? How do we collaborate with American? And how do we collaborate with Nordic? And it just made perfect sense to the people we were working with that, of course, if we're building a really, really international cluster around drones, we need to have the Chinese and the Americans and the Nordics and the Israeli closely integrated into that cluster project. So again, that's it's a big question. I'd be happy to take it in more detail later on, but that would be my short answer. So we're almost at the end of the webinar. I really want to thank you for the questions. I do hope you find this useful. I do hope you find this relevant. I fully understand that some of you may be sort of working hands-on and you know all this, while some of you may be not as experienced and you're quite new to this. So we really try to make it relevant for all the stakeholders and all the audiences. If you have any comments, if you have any questions, we'd be super happy to take those by email later on. I want to thank you for joining us. We have more writing to do. We have more tools to develop, and hopefully we'll get a chance to connect with you and learn more in the future. And if some of you have some really interesting case studies, hey, you should come and see what we're doing. You should maybe interview us. Be super happy to connect and say, what can we learn and what can we bring into the community as a whole? So on that note, I want to thank you for joining, and I wish you a wonderful morning. I wish you a wonderful evening, depending on where you are. And I look forward to seeing you again later. Thank you very much. All the best.